happening because already the machinery of propaganda and disinformation is set in, and people are talking about a magic warrant requirement, which has appeared in here, which is complete and utter nonsense. But let me start by echoing the distinguished chairman of the Rules Committee. This is an appalling, Kafkaesque process leading to an absurd Orwellian result. This is much worse than what was being offered before of the clean 2-year reauthorization. The substance of this proposal is utterly appalling. They say you shouldn't look to see how the sausage gets made. This isn't even sausage. This is scrapple. It's scrapple with dog food mixed inside of it. Now I'm going to have to try to read through it to understand what they're doing. But let's start with this. Originally, they proposed an 18-month clean reauthorization. And the Democrats and some members of the Freedom Caucus were very skeptical of the enterprise, said 18 months. That's not like any short-term extension we know around here. Usually we talk about 72 hours or a week or 2 weeks. 18 months, that's a huge, massive expansion. So then they went into some kind of compromise session with the White House. None of us were invited, so we don't know who was there or what was spoken. But they went from 18 months to 5 years. They went from a clean 2-year reauthorization to a 5-year dirty deal. And the saving grace of it is supposed to be a so-called warrant requirement, which I'll investigate in a second, which doesn't kick in for another 2 years. So we have 2 years without their illusory Band-Aid that they're putting on this process, this fake warrant requirement. So the Trump administration can do whatever they want, even without this mythical, inscrutable warrant requirement, and then we get 5 more years of this. And this is the compromise that they worked out behind our backs, and all we could rely on was the goodwill of the handful of members of the Freedom Caucus who are standing up for the Constitution and the civil liberties and civil rights of the people. So I don't think that our friends in the Freedom Caucus have done the American people any favor if they're signing off on this. All right, so the first thing that they do is they change the terms of the length of the legislation. A 5-year authorization with the fraudulent warrant requirement not kicking in for 2 years. All right, well, let's look at the much vaunted. Let's start with this in trying to understand the gobbledygook here. The FBI may not ingest unminimized information acquired under this section into its analytic repositories unless the targeted person is relevant to an existing, open, predicated, full national security investigation by the FBI. If the subject of such predicated full national security investigation is a U.S. person, for purposes of this paragraph, the investigation must be supported by probable cause. Okay, this is supposed to be the big concession to the people who are saying that the Constitution governs and the Fourth Amendment is still alive, right? Well, what's the first thing that I notice as someone who spent 25 years as a constitutional law professor? Well, the operative part of it is the last 8 words there. The investigation must be supported by probable cause. It doesn't say it's got to be supported by a search warrant, much less does it say it's got to be supported by a search warrant or probable cause determined by a judge, by a court. That's not in there. So who's going to figure out whether it's supported by probable cause? And we're not talking about evidence of a crime, we're talking about a predicated national security investigation. Well, you flip the page, and you find out the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence shall jointly establish procedures and standards for officers and employees of the United States government to determine the existence of probable cause. Well, there goes the requirement, the constitutional requirement of an independent magistrate issuing a warrant. The FBI will be the judge of its own warrant. In other words, we're right back to the problem that got us here in the first place. Right? Now, look above there. We are told, pursuant to subsection B, no officer or employee of the U.S. government may intentionally target for acquisition the communications of a U.S. person pursuant to an authorization issued under subsection A, pursuant to other provisions of this act. In the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, the government may seek a warrant or other appropriate order supported by a probable cause showing to target for collection the communications of a U.S. person if there exists probable cause that the U.S. person is a foreign power, etc., etc. May. Suddenly we go from the Constitution's imposition of a mandatory requirement for a warrant, the exception to it. But this simply says they may seek a warrant. They don't have to. They may seek a warrant. In other words, this provision 2 is meaningless. It just returns us to exactly where we were. Thank you, Mr. McGovern. It takes us right back to the status quo. So, when it says that the Attorney General, that would be Kash Patel, oh no, that would be, forgive me, Todd Blanchard, the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanchard, and the Director of D&I shall establish the procedures for determining if there's probable cause. Gee, I thought that James Madison and George Mason had taken care of that. I thought the Constitution established the meaning of probable cause. Now it's being delegated to the acting Attorney General. Actually, it doesn't even say the acting, but whoever the Attorney General might be. Perhaps acting is imported through this language. Who knows? Do we really want Pam Bondi or Kash Patel or Todd Blanchard figuring out what our Fourth Amendment rights are, and then they get to decide for themselves without going to a court? At the very least, even if we're not going to have an actual warrant, there must be an independent judge, a magistrate involved in defining whether or not there's probable cause to search American citizens. That's the bottom line here. Everybody knows and understands our Constitution. And yes, our Constitution applies in peacetime, it applies in wartime. It applies to American citizens in America, it applies to American citizens abroad. And we're very willing to sit down to try to figure out some way we can deal with this thorny area of the law, but sneaky meetings at the White House behind everybody's back and then votes in 2:30 in the morning are not going to do it for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights of the American people. I thank you, Mr. McGovern, and you'll back.
Dilmer, sir.
Great Matter Robotics, an autonomous robotic systems manufacturing company, signing a memorandum of understanding with America's largest domestic shipbuilder to integrate its physical AI into the country's domestic shipbuilding operations. This new partnership with Huntington Ingalls Industries will help meet the growing demands of the U.S. Navy on the global stage. I want to bring in Great Matter Robotics CEO Ariane Kabir. Ariane, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on this. This is really amazing about this, because to see, obviously, with the conflict in Iran right now, but also just the fact that we've heard President Trump say he wants to bring American ships back to the forefront, back into that leadership position. How are you part of that?
Thanks for having me. As you know, demands for physical goods are soaring. On the other hand, the skilled workforce in manufacturing is shrinking down pretty much on a daily basis. And shipbuilding is one critical component for our national security, one of the major critical components for our national security. Just within the submarine industrial base, we have 5 million skilled man-hours short today. And we just launched this partnership with Huntington Ingalls Industries, the nation's largest shipbuilder. They make all the aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers. They're also launching unmanned vessels. If you look at manufacturing all these components, it goes through a range of tool manipulation problems, very complex and very tedious and ergonomically challenging tasks. Grinding, blasting, coating, inspection, painting, you name it. And there is not enough skilled workers anymore in the US to do those jobs. At Great Matter Robotics, we are developing physical AI that's augmenting our workforce, that's giving them the productivity to become 10x, 20x, 50x more productive to perform all these operations hand in hand. So we deliver these solutions at the factories where we create this optimal teaming between humans, robots, and AI to boost productivity from the same footprint and help the manufacturers bring their costs down. So with Huntington Ingalls Industries, We're building the next generation shipyard with an approach of autonomy first and creating that optimal human-robot and AI orchestration.
Now, we're not just talking about military ships, we're also talking about cargo ships, correct?
With Huntington Ingalls Industries, it's mostly the military ships that we're focused on, but in general, yes. At Preventer Robotics, we are working across many different industries: aerospace, national security, maritime, shipbuilding, and many other manufacturing industries. Because, as you know, we have to make sure our whole industrial base is supported as a whole. I mean, there are 70,000 manufacturers in the U.S. Out of them, the top 159, they have a 3.2